Key factor of a good debater is not just speaking out or speaking out loud, but by listening.
Debating is about relationships. Conversation is about the relationship. And so some of what I'm trying to do with the book is give people individual skills that they can use to speak out. But more than that, it's about how we better connect with those around us. To be able to look our differences head on, to be able to talk about them, and more importantly, to be able to fashion something positive out of our disagreements. A set of practices that helps us build relationships and hopefully society, and maybe slightly beneath that, organizations that can sustain a culture of conversation.
So, Bo So-san, welcome to PIVOT.
Ryan-san, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you are a bestseller author, a journalist, and a debater, and two-time debating world champion and former coach of the Harvard debate team.
I am.
And you have your new book, まずは聞くから始めよう. It's good arguments.
That's right.
So you're like professional of debates.
Yes, that's something like that. That's right. Yeah, I've been doing it a long time.
Okay, so maybe we Japanese people are not good at debating, and also the PIVOT audience, we are kind of interested in what debate is, what means to be a good debater. So I'd like to ask you about tips. But first of all, let me ask about yourself. So you are originally from Korea, and you moved from Korea to Australia when you were 8 years old. Could you tell me about your life?
That's right. I think you've made a similar move yourself.
Yes.
And when I moved, I didn't speak English. And so I learned what a lot of people do when they're in that situation, which is real life conversation is pretty difficult. It's different to what the textbooks say they might be like. And even of the real life conversations, the hardest things are disagreements, right? And when you're an outsider, obviously different from the people around you, you feel like you should be able to talk about those differences. But somehow those conversations tend to be the most challenging. They're the ones where the words just caught on my throat and I wasn't able to get them out. And when you stand out, as I did, and when the main thing that you want is to fit in, the last thing you want to do is to draw attention to your differences.
Yes.
Right? And so the combination of those two things, being the only Asian kid in a very white school in a white part of Australia, I decided to be very agreeable, right? To smile and to nod and get along with people as best I could. And I thought I would live out the rest of my life in that way, keeping most of my thoughts to myself, maybe sharing it with family when I got home, but having a public face and then a private one. And what changed for me was in the 5th grade, so in elementary school, when a teacher made me a promise that on the debating team, when one person speaks, no one else does. And for me, who had been spoken over and interrupted and spun out of conversation, that was irresistible. And debate is such a strange thing, and we'll get into all of that. It doesn't seem like the most intuitive thing for someone like me, but somehow there was a strange fit. I was able to make it my own. And as you said in your introduction, it's who I am.
Were you a shy boy?
I still am.
You're a debate champion.
Maybe not a boy.
How can you be shy when you're a champion of debates?
In a strange way, I think I was able to achieve some success in debating because I was shy.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is, when you think about the average debater, probably they are the person who's willing to put their hand up and speak up and be loud.
Yes.
But my own pathway through this activity began with a practice of listening, of reading the room, of thinking through things 3 or 4 times before I actually put them out into the world. Now, that has its own dangers. The main one being you can wait too long before raising your voice. And I think some in the audience, your viewers, might have had similar experiences where you wait 1 beat, you wait 2 beats, just say, I'm going to get it out, but you missed the chance. I know that feeling intimately. I still do it every day. But it was being able to take those weaknesses, personalities, dispositions, but not only that, also cultural inheritances, right? Certain views about hierarchy and family, and making them my own. I think that was my path through debating.
Wow, you just made an important point, because the key factor of a good debater is not just speaking out or speaking out loud, but by listening. So that's a very good point, because in Japan, maybe in Korea, maybe East Asia, it's kind of quite rude to speak out, especially if there's a senior person. But you're stating that good listener is a good debater.
Yes, I think that's right. So the way in which I define a good debate, a good disagreement, is it's one in which both sides walk away feeling like they would do that again. Right? And now some people wish I would make bigger promises, right? Maybe my publisher does, that I can say, a good argument is one where you're going to get a raise and you're going to get your way and you're going to be able to defeat your opponents and so on. And maybe sometimes you'll be able to do that.
So winning is...
right?
Yeah.
But maybe it's a different definition of winning. To be able to sustain a relationship, to be able to sustain a conversation. So I think that point is really quite key, that debating is about relationships. Conversation is about the relationship. And so some of what I'm trying to do with the book is give people individual skills that they can use to speak out. But more than that, it's about how we better connect with those around us. To be able to look our differences head on, to be able to talk about them, and more importantly, to be able to fashion something positive out of our disagreements.
So before going to the skills and tips, let's go back to the point, because in Japan, there's a term called ronpa, which means to defeat someone by debating.
Yes.
You have to win. You have to walk out the room and feel that you won. You pointed out the fact that the person is wrong. So that's very different from what you call debate in your definition.
Absolutely. And, we have a similar term in Korea, 끝장 토론, which is to end or to terminate. And the English language abounds in similar concepts of using the metaphor of war, for example, to describe argument. And in some ways, this is precisely the opposite. So the tradition that I come from is one in which often it's young students who can get involved. And one advantage of debating is it's easy enough for young people to learn, but it takes a lifetime to master. And one of the things that you notice when you look at those young kids is they get into a room, they argue till their faces are red. If they were in this room, you wouldn't be able to see. They would camouflage.
It's pink.
But then they meet the next week, debate about something completely different, and do it all over again. And they're able to form real friendships and relationships over time. I think that's really important, because no single disagreement defines a relationship, whether it be friendships, romantic relationships, or colleagues. Somewhere in the back of your mind should always be the idea that you're going to have to do this again. And so that idea of beating someone into submission or destroying them, terminating them, maybe it works for that 1 hour, but you're going to have to see them again.
Right.
And so what we need instead is a set of practices, an ethic that allows us to continue talking with one another, knowing that sometimes you're going to lose the argument, sometimes you're going to win the argument, but you want to be playing by a set of rules that you can embrace. So I think that's what debate is at its core. It's about a set of practices that helps us build relationships and hopefully society, and maybe slightly beneath that, organizations that can sustain a culture of conversation.
So having that said, how can you become a good debater?
Yeah, it takes time and it takes practice. But the great advantage of debating is that it tells you you're not alone, that this is a challenge that we as a human race have been facing for as long as we've been alive.
Yes, absolutely.
And that a community of people have come up with some practices that can help guide you along. So my journey has been, I was a shy kid, unsure in language, unsure in what to do, how to handle myself in conversation. And I had a series of coaches who took me through the tradition of debating. It's a tradition that in the West has its tradition in ancient Greece, but there are comparable analogs in Buddhist traditions and these
really?
and all sorts of other places.
So it's not just a Western thing.
Certainly not. Certainly not. And I think that's it does Asian cultures a great disservice to say there aren't deep philosophical traditions of disagreement and argument. They manifest in different ways. And one of the things that I hope to say with this is, here's a set of tools from my very particular background. And I hope your audience, people listening, will do what Japanese culture seems especially good at, which is adapting things from the outside world and making it their own. So to answer the question, there's a set of skills, and we're going to talk about a few of them, I think, that can help guide you along. And then once you kind of get an understanding of what the debate methodology is all about, then it's about time and practice. And the good news is there's no shortage of opportunities to practice something like debate, because it can be around the kitchen table, it can be in the playground, it can be at the workplace, it can be online, it can be with all these people that we share our time and lives with.
So our audience can read your book, but to keep the conversation short, what's like the 3 more important tips of a good debater?
I'll walk you through a few. So I think the first tip, as the title suggests, is to start with listening. Right? And that isn't the title in the United States, actually. And it's not just a marketing decision, although I hope it'll be an effective one. I think it's a really wonderful act of perception on the part of Hayakawa to call the book that, because to be able to really connect, to be able to make the conversation about the interaction between the two of you and not just about what you believe, there has to be that understanding of where the other person is coming from. So the first thing I would say is you don't even have to start with disagreement. Start with understanding. Right? So where is the person coming from? Ask lots of questions about why they believe the things that they believe. And one of the toolkits that I give in the book is to decide whether it's worth having an argument at all. And the checklist that I give is called the RISA checklist, is to ask whether the disagreement between you and the other side is real, or you misunderstood or imagined something, whether it's important enough to justify having the disagreement, whether it's specific enough, so you're not tackling some issue that's going to take many days to sort through in the 20 minutes that you have in a meeting, and to check whether the two sides are aligned. So it's about trying to understand the acoustics of the room that you're walking into before you launch into saying your piece. So the first thing is choose your battles, know whether the conditions are there for a good disagreement. That's where I would start. Once you've done that, I'll give you 2 other little pieces. The second bit of advice is to start with some amount of agreement. Right? Agreement. So start every disagreement with some agreement. And that's agreement about how you're going to have the conversation. So some ground rules. So when I told that story about my first getting started in debate, it can be as simple as we're going to get roughly equal time to speak. And we're not going to interrupt each other. So you're going to have a chance to respond, but you don't have to do it while I'm speaking.
Right.
That was so important to me as a kid in being able to raise my voice. And that sense that we're setting up the boundaries of our conversation together. That we're not just opponents, but we're collaborators too.
Interesting.
I think that can be very useful. So that's agreement about how we have the conversation, but also what the conversation is about. And there too, it can actually be really difficult, right? Whether the disagreement is what it seems like on surface, whether you're really disagreeing about where to go for dinner, or whether there's some underlying conversation that's happening, whether it's really about who makes the decisions in our relationship, for example. That takes a little bit of sorting through.
Right.
But being able to say, this is what we're disagreeing about, and this is how we're going to disagree, and starting with that level of agreement, I think can be useful. The third bit of advice I'll give is has to do with the concept of empathy. Right? And again, it's intimately connected with listening. And the third bit of advice is to get out of your own head for a second. So the way in which debaters do that is we have something called the side switch exercises. And that's where after you've kind of thought about what you want to say, and in our case, you would write it down, you take a minute before you present it to turn to a new sheet of paper and write down the best arguments for the other side. Or look through what you have prepared and try and poke as many holes into it as you can find.
Okay, so you try to pretend to be the other person, your opponent.
Absolutely, yeah. And for now, it's imagination. It's not a substitute for really hearing what they are, but to put yourself in that slightly awkward, adjacent position of thinking, oh, I could have messed up here. I might have to think about this again. I think that creates the condition for something like empathy, for listening, for connection. So the third bit of advice would be to get out of your own head and to get used to that idea that even when you're thinking about your own certainties, your own opinions, your own ideas and experiences, that there may be another perspective, another way of viewing it.
So do you mean that if I were to ask my boss for a raise, I should try to think like my boss?
Absolutely, yeah. And the other voices in the room who may be there in that decision making. So playing that conversation out, and so you have an argument that you might present, you expect this response from the boss, then you improve your first argument, right? So now you have version 2. And repeating that process is like co-work. It's co-authorship, collaboration. And the more you can do that, I think the more agile the arguments become, the more multivocal it becomes too. And so that's precisely the point. Yeah.
Right. But I think, so the dilemma is that in order to kind of agree with someone with the format or to agree to disagree, the other person had to have the same mindset as myself. What if the other opponent or the other person is like a bad debater and he or she is trying to defeat me? How can I respond to that?
That's such a good question. And we're seeing it more and more in some settings, aren't we? So I'd say two things about that. So I think the first is debate is just one way to have a disagreement, right? Another way is if you and I negotiate, I don't have to really question your arguments or rebut you. We just have to find a workable solution. And I think in some instances that may be the appropriate way to go. But debate, I think, answers a real deep need that we have to express ourselves, to have that be heard and responded to. That's different to negotiation, right? That's different to saying, okay, that's you. Let's see if we can work out something. It's this is what I think about what you said. What do you think about what I said? And then I'm going to respond to you. So I think the first is recognizing debate is not the only way, and that there may be sometimes if it's with someone who doesn't accept really fundamental premises you would need for the conversation, just to say, okay, you say your piece, I'll say my piece, and let's see if we can work on something. That's an okay option. But, and I think related in and this is the second point, is we should be able to articulate what it is that we want from conversation and what debate can do in that context. And where it is about listening, being heard, expressing ourselves, seeing the ways in which our ideas interact, being able to do that on a continuing basis, I think debate answers that call.
I'd like to give an example of like a real business setting.
I think one is, in earnest, I'll give you the perspective from the top and from the bottom. So, and both are relevant, being able to say, in this meeting, it's not only okay, but it's expected that I hear from your perspective. Now, and another one, which is the flip of what I said earlier, is knowing the uses and limits of disagreement, right? So I don't want to shy away from, in this book, from the fact that debate can be fun. It's a spectacle, it's a contest.
Yes.
It is about competing.
Yes.
And so I don't want us to be all angelic in the way in which we think about it.
Yes.